This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
It is 11:06, time for Ask a Rabbi.
And this is Rabbi Shafir Lobb of Congregation Eitz Chaim in Port St. Lucie, Florida. Please feel free to give me a call and ask any question you'd like to ask a rabbi at 772-340-1590. That's 1590 for WPSL Digital 1590. And you can hear us on Alexa, Google Home, and all kinds of different places. And you can see me live on Facebook right now. So, welcome to Ask a Rabbi. And I'm going to start off today with kind of an interesting question that somebody asked me. And this one might tickle a few folks. But in Leviticus, there's a quote that says, "Love your neighbor as you love yourself." Imagine that. And somebody said to me, well, didn't Jesus originate that? And the answer is no. He was quoting Leviticus. He quotes a number of passages out of Torah, out of the first 5 books. And a good number of them are out of Leviticus. And a lot of people think that Leviticus is just a whole bunch of restrictive rules. And it's not. It's actually quite freeing, but you have to understand it. Like, love your neighbor as you love yourself. You know, that sounds
Seems
like,
like common sense.
Yeah, it it's in all faith traditions that people say things like that. People talk about Islam. Islam says, you'll be surprised you'll get into heaven, right? God is the one who makes that decision, not us. And right, vengeance is mine is what we have in Torah. That means, you don't run around doing that. You don't run around upping the ante when you're upset with someone.
How many years before Christ was Leviticus?
Oh, only 1,000 or 2 or 3.
Okay, well.
About 1,000 years, yeah.
Okay.
We're talking about Moses, so that's before the entry into the land, right? And then you've got the whole, you've got Saul, you've got the period of Judges. However long that was. Then you've got Saul as a king for not a whole lot of years, but then David for most of his life. He becomes a king when he's fairly young and lives to be an old man. And then he passes it off to Bathsheba's second child. We know that it's the second child, right? Because the love child is the one that doesn't make it. It's the only child that dies in scriptures. Yeah.
Love child.
Well,
okay.
What would you call it? She's married to Uriah.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's, and I believe that that's the reason we have the story of that death in scriptures, is because they want to make sure that you know that the king is not that child, because Bathsheba's son is Solomon, who gets the throne from David. And so, it's kind of important that he not be an illegitimate child. Right? It's amazing how often scriptures has this slight political tinge to it. That's one of those cases. And and then we've got all of the kings after the north and southern kingdom split off after Solomon, because Solomon's son was even worse than Solomon. And and in fact, the northern kingdom sends the representatives to his son and says, how are you going to treat us? It was hard under your father. Life was not good with all the heavy taxes, the conscripted labor. And he says, if you think my dad was bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. And they said, see ya. Right? And the northern kingdom split off. And so you've got all of that period of time. And then you have, scriptures for Jews closes, right? Closes at the end of that period. And then you have the exile and the return with Ezra and Nehemiah. And, it's believed that they redacted a lot of the stories that they carried with them and brought back. So, these are old. These are very, very old. So, and that would have been what Jesus would have been raised on, because, despite some folks who'd like to have it otherwise, Jesus was born, raised, and died and killed for being Jewish. So, yeah, what can you say, right? So he would have learned Torah. In fact, there's a wonderful account that I think is actually a bar mitzvah celebration, where in Christian scriptures it talks about Jesus being questioned at the temple. I think that's a bar mitzvah ritual. Yeah, because it happens at the age of 12, and that's the youngest that a boy can be a bar mitzvah. For a girl, it's somewhere in 11 to 12. The ancients recognize that women mature a little bit earlier than men, both physically and emotionally.
Some men never mature.
Some men, I won't go there. That's not a safe place for a female rabbi to go. So, yeah. Some people take a longer time to reach maturity. Let's say it that way. And it's not necessarily by gender. So, yeah. So lots of things are going on. And, right. So that's one of the quotes that Jesus does out of scriptures. The other one that he does is the Shema, right? Hear, O Israel, God is God, right? That's the Shema coming to us out of Deuteronomy. So there's a lot of quoting that goes on. And even the quote where Jesus says, I'm the voice of the one who calls out in the wilderness, he's quoting Isaiah. And there's nothing wrong with quoting scriptures. So that's to all the folks who had that question. No, Jesus didn't originate the idea of love. Love is, in fact, the main theme of the first 5 books of scriptures. It's not revenge or anger or wrath or any of that stuff. It really is love. And, sometimes, though, love can be tough love. It can be instructions that maybe we don't necessarily want to understand or implement because they're hard. Like, have one set of weights when you buy and when you sell. Yeah. Yeah.
Really?
Something about being honest in business. Imagine that. Yeah. Can't imagine
Even back then.
Even back then. Right. So there's 2 parts that you have to realize when you have an instruction like that. Right. One thing is that clearly the ancients in Scripture and God care about whether or not you live a righteous life, a moral life. Secondly, people weren't doing it or they wouldn't have to give the instructions. Right. Like I like to point out to my students at IRSC, you didn't have a speed limit of don't go over 75 miles an hour before cars could do it. Because it just wasn't necessary. I love reading you and I are both have time in Tucson, and Speedway got its name because people used to speed on the roadway. That's how it got its name. And, until people did that, you didn't need to limit speeds.
We used to in our KVOA news vans, too.
Yes. Yeah, right. Yeah. What's the statute of limitations on Yeah. So, because that's kind of part of the fun thing. I teach this year, this semester, the summer semester, we're in our second week of this whirlwind called Summer A, and then the second whirlwind called Summer B. But for Summer A, I'm teaching Intro to Humanities, which is basically applied philosophy. You look at the theories of philosophy, and then you apply them, and it's fascinating. It's a great pathway through. In my class we've done healthcare ethics, we've done lawyer ethics, and we're going to be moving on to other things like politics and religion.
Lawyer and ethics in the same sentence.
Yeah.
Really?
Well, there's a great video that I show the students called "Can a Lawyer Be a Good Person?" Yeah, it's a great TED Talk, and I recommend it to anyone. You can probably Google, if you Google "Can a Lawyer Be a Good Person?" TED Talk, you'll find it. It is a great talk, and the gentleman who does the talk had been a public defender in D.C. And he talks about, people who are incarcerated unfairly and people who are not incarcerated unfairly. He also talks about guilty people who get off, right, who get acquitted, and how does a lawyer defend a guilty person? And and they have to give a guilty person a person whom they believe is guilty. Because, in fact, you're not guilty until you're proven guilty, right? That's the American system. Even if you confess, it still has to get entered into the court before you're officially guilty. Because our presumption is innocence. Now, that's not necessarily true in the public eye, as has been demonstrated over and over again, because if we really believed that premise in the public eye, then politics would be a lot cleaner.
So back in the Old Testament,
Or Jewish scriptures, yes.
Jewish scriptures, were people thinking in that direction? Like in
are people innocent until proven guilty?
Yeah.
Yes, they actually are, because
Okay.
they say 2 weeks ago we read the portion that said, don't give favor to a poor man out of sympathy, and don't elevate a rich man because he's rich.
I remember that.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're thinking that, and then it says if somebody is guilty or charged with a capital crime, then there must be at least 2 or hopefully 3 independent witnesses to testify that they saw this person commit the crime and that the person was warned that it was in fact a crime. Ooh, right. So there's a secondary piece there that isn't in American legal system. Everybody has their own legal system, and the American system has some roots in scriptures, but not all of them. And and that's true everywhere, right? Everybody's got, and people, as Stuart mentioned as I was listening on my way in, we amend laws as we find that we need to, based on what's happening and what we learn. And we've learned a lot. I look back at what we thought we knew when I was a child and what we know now about humans, about science, about genetics, about so many things. And, if we've learned this much in the last years, then how much are we going to learn in the next 100, 200, 300 years? It boggles the minds. What are the things that we think are absolutely true right now that we're going to find, maybe not?
But your teachings don't go back hundreds; they go back thousands.
Thousands. Well, it depends on which, right? Yeah.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Scriptures clearly goes back thousands of years. The Dead Sea Scrolls have scrolls that predate, the Dead Sea, Qumran, right? The community in Qumran was devastated by the Romans between 67 and 70 when they were basically going through the countryside. And according to Roman records, obliterated 987 Judean towns. Yeah, I mean, that's just, the number is, what they had to have done. They basically did wipe Judea off the map and carted off a lot of people as slaves and left a bunch of bodies to rot out in the desert. And it's, you find some of those when they did the archaeology. They have actually found bodies. Some you don't find because the animals get them, etc. And but the scrolls that were at the Dead Sea Scrolls match pretty well scriptures as we have it today in Hebrew. The Hebrew then and the Hebrew now. I've walked up to the scroll that's on the exhibit. That's an Isaiah scroll that's exhibited at the Israel Museum, and I can read it. It's and it's there are not that many differences. There's a couple of, the biggest thing in one of the books, I think it's Samuel, one of the books of Samuel, there's a paragraph that the Dead Sea Scrolls have that we don't have in scriptures, that apparently got somehow obliterated over the thousands of years. But for it to be so much alike that there's only a letter here or there that's different. And if you pick up a Jewish scriptures, it'll tell you where those differences are, because they actually discuss it and talk about, was this a scribal error? Which is more likely the correct version? But, that's 2,300 years old, because the scrolls that they found there were about 200 to 300 years old when they were put into the caves, for whatever reasons they were put in the caves. It might have been that they were torn and not in great shape and no longer usable. Some people think it was a library. I don't, I've looked at those caves, and unless the geography has really, really changed, which earthquakes do, but it's not where you're going to end up casually. So I think it might have been what we call a geniza, which is where you put scrolls until you can bury them. So you store them. And those storage places are some of the best archives for old manuscripts. There was a geniza in Egypt that was found. People have found different storage places where people had
And these are caves, right?
Well, they're not always caves. Sometimes they're part of a building.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and actually, even in our temple, we kind of do that. There are documents that I have, or old prayer books, that you don't just throw them in the trash, because God's kind of in them. So, and if you've got a scroll that has God's name in it, you're not going to throw it away either. And so you put it somewhere, and those documents need to be buried. And you either do once a year a little burial ceremony if you've got a good agreement with one of the cemeteries in the area, and there are a number, and we do have some good agreements. But the other thing that you do is you talk to families and you ask permission to put a little bit in different graves when people are buried. That's the parsing it method.
Mm-hmm.
And so those things are done. But while you're storing it, so, I've got a bin of old literature that is waiting to be buried. And if something would happen to me, that bin might end up in somebody's storage locker, right? Or it might be a back closet of a synagogue that's abandoned for one reason or another, perhaps a fire, right? And they run, and they don't even think about this closet that has been used for storage. So lots of reasons for that to happen. And those geniza, those storage areas, are so valuable. For example, one of the things that I like to mention is that in the one in Egypt, they found a divorce issued by a woman to her husband, right? And if you talk to the Orthodox today, they'll tell you that only a man can divorce a woman. A woman doesn't divorce a man. But here there's a couple of gittin from divorce documents from this geniza in Egypt, in Alexandria. So the woman was wealthy, she had property, and she had had enough of him, and out the door he went. She bought him off.
And her last name was Steinem.
We're not going to go there. We're not going there. So lots of interesting things over time. And so, yeah. So ethics are kind of an interesting thing.
The ethics thing is fascinating to me, that, over thousands of years, that they have existed.
Yeah. Well, here's another example of are you innocent unless proven guilty. This one's kind of an interesting one. If a man and a woman, if the woman is married to somebody else and she and somebody have relations in town, they're both stoned because they're having an improper relationship. If it's in a field, he will be stoned and she will not. It is presumed that she would have screamed her protest and not had anyone to hear her.
Oh, wait a minute.
Okay. Yeah. So that's kind of an interesting piece, right?
Huh.
Right. But if you're in town, then you didn't object. Now, what that doesn't get into is obviously there are situations where people are forced upon, both genders can end up being raped. And it happens. And they may not have been as savvy about all of the nuances of things like that. So you might ask me, what is something that we've learned that is different from what we believed 40 or 50 years ago? One of them is that the brain can't change. We used to believe that the brain, whatever you had, that your history determined your future. And you were stuck with whatever you had in your brain at any given time. And we've learned that that's not true. We've learned that brains change. Now we can actually influence ourselves. We can choose to train our brains and change the pathways. And over time, the brain changes. And time is not long. It can be 6 to 8 weeks. Can make some dramatic changes in a brain. You can rewire it.
Mm-hmm.
And people have done that now. And now, thanks to the imaging that we've got, the MRIs and
CAT
scans and all of those other wonderful techniques that we've got of actually looking at what's lighting up, and that's the thing, what's lighting up in your brain. We can see the pathways. I was watching a really fascinating video the other day of the electrical impulses on the neurons. They've got some video of that, and and you watch the brain firing, and eventually it makes a path, and it builds it, and then it goes and builds another one and another one, and that's how we form the wiring in our brains. And so you can change that. And a wonderful example of that is Gabby Giffords, right? One of the bullets that she took, right when she was shot in Tucson, went into her language center. And so basically another part of her brain, you can't restore what's been smushed, but you can rebuild other parts of your brain. And that's what she had to do. She had to learn language all over again. Right? And it's not easy, but it's doable. Right? And you might have a little bit of difficulty with this or that, and it might take you longer than you think. But you can, our brains are amazingly plastic. They're not cast iron.
It's amazing how much she's improved.
Right. It's amazing how much she's improved. And we watch stroke victims and others, right? If the stroke doesn't kill you, then you have a chance of regaining a tremendous amount. We've had people who've, were told by their doctors, you'll never walk again. And there they are off and running because they've decided, no, I'm not going to buy that verdict. And, stuck with it, and we're lucky enough to have enough health to do so. Mm-hmm. So we are amazingly plastic that way. We can change our brains. If we can change our brains, we can change a lot. Right? One of the things that was believed at the founding of our country was that if you educate women, their brains will explode because their brains are too small. Ben Franklin actually argued that was not the case. And clearly we have a bunch of women running around whose brains have not exploded and who are, in fact, highly educated. So those are things, just because the population believes something doesn't make it true. Doesn't make it true. Mm-hmm. And so how much more are we going to learn?
And it's interesting you say that about the women, because you look now, I was watching, I think it was Fox News, had a poll on incoming freshmen. Mm-hmm. It is weighted heavily on women students.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling. I mean, we're talking not
women
60-40. We're talking 75-25.
Women are definitely becoming educated.
Yeah.
And not just in the female type jobs, right? Not just to be teachers and nurses, but it's not unusual.
CEOs.
Yeah, CEOs, business, psychology. Lots of women in psychology, and an increasing number of women in the engineering fields. Not nearly, we see female astronauts all over the world now. So it's not,
Doctors.
Well, doctors have actually some have always been female. And although it's worth noting that when psychology first came to the U.S., women were not allowed to study it. The first female psychologists, it's really had a trouble getting a PhD in it because there was that much discrimination against women.
Wow.
And so we've come a long way. I was sitting yesterday. We were at a scholarship award dinner for one of the organizations that I'm a part of. And I was sitting next to a young man, and it was funny because I, started up a general conversation. Well, what classes do you like? And he said, I like physics. I thought, okay, I liked physics too. I'm one of those weird. When I was in my bachelor's program, my elective was vector mechanics. I think that was probably a little bit unusual.
Unusual?
Especially since I was in philosophy and religion at the time.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I love vectors. I really, really do love vectors. I love vectors and I love logic, Boolean logic.
Okay.
So yeah, it's just those things I can see the arguments really quickly, and it just it resonates well. So yeah, And I was probably the only philosophy and religion major they ever had that took vector mechanics as an elective. But I did, and I enjoyed it. And I look back at those times. It was interesting. And I was told, actually, by Drexel Institute that they would love to have me if I wasn't a woman. Yeah.
Great.
So coming out of, and I have no idea how my life would have been different had they said, yeah, sure, come on in. Because at that time, I wanted to study architecture. But anyway, I was sitting next to this young man who had gotten the scholarship. He's like, yeah, I'm trying to decide if I want to go into computer technology or mechanical engineering. And I'm like, that's an interest, I guess you could go into some mechanics and control circuits and things like that. Control circuits are interesting too. And I did stop short of saying, well, I have a bachelor's in mechanical engineering, because I'm this weird duck with a bachelor's in philosophy and religion and a bachelor's in mechanical engineering. Right. I joke with people when I left Goodyear, because I worked at Goodyear before I went back to school to become a rabbi. And I joke with people and say I left mechanical engineering to go into theological engineering. Right. And
okay.
Yeah. So that's a little bit of weirdness about my own. I started rabbinical school right out of college. I had this little plan, as most kids have some kind of plan, that I was going to, do my bachelor's and go right on and get my ordination and go be this wonderful, great rabbi. And life, of course, had other plans, namely taking my dad out, and because I lost him in my second year, the summer of my second year. And so I never ended up completing my ordination at that time. I had to shift gears, and I actually went to U of P in Pittsburgh and studied statistics and educational psychology, of all crazy things. And yeah. Or educational research, actually, not psychology. Educational research, yeah.
Couldn't stand statistics.
Oh, I like statistics too.
Do you?
I do. I love languages. I love math. I'm this really weird, 4-quadrant person. So I love art. I love to watercolor. I love animals. I like lots of things in each of the different areas. So, and I love to play music. I don't practice it enough. But yeah, it's one of the reasons that I probably appear to flit from things, because I have so many diverse interests.
Yeah,
but,
no kidding.
Yeah, so, yeah. And then I had to go out and earn a living because my mom and I had to live on something, and my dad did not leave enough insurance for her. So so she lived with me for a while, and it's a long checkered story, but I went from that, and I entered retail, because what are you going to do when the economy tanks, which it did at that time? Research positions are the first to go. So I did what any self-respecting grad student did. I went into retail.
Yes.
And ended up managing a flower shop. And then from there, in the not copious spare time, but in the weird hours that you have off in managing a flower shop, which is like from whenever you get the flowers delivered to the funeral homes until the evening rush, you've got an hour or two in there. And I started taking flying lessons because I'd wanted to learn to fly. And the flight school that I went to said, well, hey, you're doing such a great job. They overheard me explaining things to other students and stuff like that, and said, if you want to be an instructor, we'll help you do that. And so that kind of sounded interesting, and the person who had the flower shop sold it. So I ended up doing that, and I became a flight instructor. That's actually how I met my husband. He was one of my students.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a cool story.
Yeah, it is a fun story, because I was like, oh, we're not dating. He's just taking classes, and we just go out to dinner afterwards because we have to eat.
Uh-huh. Who bought that story?
I did. I did, and it's like, so it kind of like caught me a little bit by surprise. I think he realized that we were serious before I did. I was just along for the ride. I'm sometimes very naive.
So did he get his pilot's license?
He had his pilot's license. He was going for an advanced advanced rating.
Yep.
And that's actually how he ended up at the school, because he was in a flying club. So just flying was not an issue for him. But he wanted his instrument rating. And and I joke with him because he's a very precise individual. And when he got on the plane with me, typically students who don't have the instrument rating are all over the sky. We call them John Wayne because they're up and down. They over control the airplane. And I get in the airplane with him, and he's smooth. And I'm like, are you FAA trying to see if what I'm doing?
Oh, yeah, that could be. Yeah, sure.
I was like, I was so suspicious because he was too good a pilot. And he's always been an excellent pilot.
Does he still fly?
Neither of us do. It takes a lot of money and time to keep yourself proficient. Yeah. And I always taught, if you can't keep yourself safe, don't fly. Right.
Yeah,
so, and that's true with me too. I'm not current. And there's no way that I'm safe because you have to put in a certain number of hours to keep safe.
Ever thought in the back of your mind that you'd like to do that
Oh,
again?
yeah, of course. All the time.
Yeah.
But again, getting proficient again it's not a cheap proposition. And time is not one of my copious spare things.
You're
so
a little busy.
Yeah, so those are the combinations. But I love flying. Flying is wonderful. It's so different to be up in the sky and in God's country and punch holes in the clouds, as they say. Because I did have the advanced ratings, and I stopped being a flight instructor with the crazy. We talked about that in another one of the episodes of Ask a Rabbi. We talked about how people were suing primary instructors because when they could buy a jet and not be ready for it, it was their primary instructor's fault for not giving them common sense.
Now, were you teaching in props or jets?
In props.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Single engine, double and twin engine, and fixed wing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Cessnas. For a while I had a Grumman that's somewhere out west, and Bill, my husband, and I, and a couple other people, and a bank, owned a Cessna for a while.
Oh, okay.
And actually, we flew that Cessna. There's a picture of us at the old Orlando terminal, right? The week that they moved to the new one, we came down with both our mothers and went for a couple of days to Disney and then flew back just to fly, just to have fun.
So is this when you were in Pittsburgh?
Ohio.
Ohio, okay.
In Ohio. And
so now how long a flight was that?
It took us the better part of a day. We left early in the morning, and I think we got in around 2 or 3. It was kind of interesting. My mother-in-law didn't want to fly with us. Yeah, no comment.
She's afraid of getting thrown out.
Yeah.
But it's a whole different story.
Yeah, my mother did fly with us, so it was the 3 of us, and we dropped her off at the main airport to go take her commercial flight, and then we picked her up here in Orlando with the rental car. So between the stops that she had and the layovers, we actually got down here just a little bit ahead of her. We had to make one stop en route to refuel, and had a good time. That we flew higher coming down than most flights are, because most of the time you're just tooling around to look at the countryside. You don't go all that high, and you go somewhere for lunch or for dinner because you got to have an excuse to get in the airplane and fly. And this was also in some ways an excuse, but it also was a great way to have fun and come down.
When I was a young copywriter at Channel 5 in Los Angeles, our anchor, Hal Fishman, the late Hal Fishman, had a plane, and he'd say one night, he said, "Let's go to lunch tomorrow."
Yeah.
Where's lunch? Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
You have lunch at the Santa Barbara airport and then fly back to L.A.
Yeah.
It was wonderful.
Yeah. Well, it was basically an excuse for a flight of X number of miles.
Yeah.
We used to know where all the good airport restaurants were.
Sure.
And a lot of
they're usually pretty good.
They're usually pretty good, and because they have this kind of traffic, right? So, and people will spend decent money for a meal. And the other thing that you find a lot of airport restaurants will do is have really good pancake kind of breakfasts or steak and egg breakfasts or something like that. Again, because pilots will plan across country, then have a breakfast and then fly home. You meet your friends, you all fly and converge in. And when I was at the flight school, we used to periodically arrange 20 flights going to this restaurant or whatever.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was a great way to have people get their flight time in, and then you have the camaraderie of the meal, and then you flew home. So yeah, you do all kinds of things like that. And I left that, like I said, because it was getting crazy, and because I also wanted to match the hours. I wanted to be off when my husband was off. So as we say, I started flying a desk and started working at Goodyear, which is one of the places that offered me a position. And because he worked at Goodyear, it seemed a reasonably good idea to do. So he worked in the main headquarters, and I worked in the tech center. I was a tire designer.
See, now you could have been at Goodyear a blimp pilot.
Yeah.
I've been up in those several times.
They're I have never been up in it.
Oh gosh,
you were in the media. You have the best chance of getting in the blimp.
Well, and we use the Goodyear blimp a lot at ESPN. So yeah,
right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you had a much better chance of that. A customer has a much better chance than an employee has. So I mean, I could look at it, and I certainly was in the hangar in Akron, Canton. That big hangar that the dirigibles used to be in.
Sure.
And no, it does not form rain clouds and rain, but condensation does form on the upper structure, and condensation does drop down as water. So it's not raining inside, but it does drip.
It was wet.
Inside the building, yeah. It can be. If it's a humid day, because the humid air rises, and it hits the metal, which is cooler, and then it condenses and drips down.
But the pilots that I knew, especially the ones in Los Angeles, they're amazing.
Yeah,
they were just amazing guys, and they had some stories.
Oh yeah, well you have to be able to plan. You have to really be able to plan to fly a blimp.
It's not exactly a magic carpet ride.
No, it's very slow responding. You put the correction in, and then you count to 100, and maybe the blimp will think about starting in that direction. Yeah, you have to really plan. It's like, I don't want to hit that building. Let's turn 500 miles before we get there. But yeah, and so there's this real strict right of way. You do not force a blimp to yield to your little airplane.
Sure.
Right, the little airplane yields to.
Now that's a good question. When you get into a metro area, how does that work?
Oh, the blimp has right of way.
Okay.
Everybody flies around. Everybody flies out of the way of the blimp. Right. Helicopters have to give in to everything because they're the most maneuverable. And it's really done by order of maneuverability, and yeah. Now, at the other side of that's kind of funny. There were a couple of occasions where I flew into Greater Pittsburgh Airport in my little tiny airplane. And I can remember one time sitting there waiting for Tower to give me clearance, and apparently they couldn't see me due to the shrubbery, etc. And they, gave the jet behind me permission. And the jet behind me said, I'm number 2. And the Tower came over and said, "Is there an airplane in front of you?" And
no.
And the pilot of that commercial jet said, "An itty bitty one." And then I piped up and reminded the Tower that I was waiting for clearance to take off. And it used to be one of the jokes that we used to do. We used to say, Cessna 747 Hotel Zulu. Ready for takeoff, 7 Hotel Zulu Heavy, ready for takeoff. And they have to give you heavy clearance when you do that. Heavy clearance means you're a big jet that's heavyweight.
Yeah,
and why that's important is because you're going to have wake turbulence that can cause problems for aircraft behind you if you're extra heavy.
Oh, I never thought of that.
So, but as soon as you declare yourself heavy, the controllers have no choice. They have to give you clearance. So it was one of the ways of sneaking a little extra space out. But obviously they don't like that, because if you're in a congested airport and you're demanding extra clearance, again, that's a maneuverability thing too. It's both a difference for the aircraft behind you, and it's and the other thing that was funny about that is, so I take off, and I hear him clearing the jet behind us to take off, and says, caution, wake turbulence. And I'm like, yeah, right, off of my Cessna. So.
But I never thought of that, taking off behind a jet.
Yeah, you have to, I was, when I was at Greater Pitt, I was very conscious of wake turbulence. And I can remember one time in my little Grumman feeling even just the jet in front of me firing up their engines and going, oh, dang, this thing wants to fly. Let me, making sure that I had enough space between it and me, that it didn't blow me off the taxiway.
Sure.
Because airplanes do want to fly. They're designed to fly. And sticking on the ground is something they only do because gravity insists on it. So the first excuse they have, they get airborne, which is why you tie airplanes down. So that they don't depart in windstorms like my tree did last week. So those are kind of interesting things. So that's really the long story of it. So then I went and worked for Goodyear, designed tires, and worked in the factory and had a great time with that. And then one day decided to go back to school and become a rabbi.
That's very cool.
And finish up what I'd started so many years before. And then it's kind of interesting. And then Tucson contacted me and said, would you consider a small congregation out in Tucson, Arizona? And that took us to Tucson, and then family brought us back east. And so we ended up here in Port St. Lucie, and we love Port St. Lucie. It's a great place to live. It really is, and we enjoy that. And I'm loving the little congregation that we've got now, Eitz Chaim. Eitz Chaim's a great congregation. I'm going to riff a little bit and talk about it. And I invite anybody to come and join us and check us out. We've got meditation Jewish meditation.
Oh, that day too, huh?
Jewish meditation on Mondays at 1:00. Please join us for that. If you've ever wanted to know what Jewish meditation, you want to change your brain and make it calmer, make it more focused, make it increase your memory, all kinds of things, sleep better. Those are all benefits of meditating. And so we have a Jewish meditation class. And we obviously have Friday night services every Friday at 7:30. And we are very musical. We do a lot of singing. And if you don't know the songs, that's okay. You will over time. You get to learn them. And then Saturday morning we have Stolen Moments. You can ask some of these Torah questions from 9:30 to 10:30, and then services start at 10:30. And I'm going to mention that we've got a bar mitzvah celebration coming up June 15th. My gosh, that seems like next week. He's getting close. He's really sounding good, and he's getting ready. So we'll be doing that. And then we've got Shavuot coming. We've got Lag BaOmer. Lots of wonderful things.
How many kids get bar or bat mitzvah?
Most.
Most do? Okay.
Well, most that if the family is at all connected to a congregation.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of peer pressure among the kids to do it. Plus, they get a party, and they think that they want to do it for the party. But I've had a few kids that actually have cried at the party, saying that they thought the party was going to be the be-all and the end-all, and they were so unhappy that the bar mitzvah celebration, the celebration in the temple, was over. Because they really enjoyed being in charge of the bima. But when I take a student through a bar and bat mitzvah, they own that bima, and I let them run the service. It's their service. It's their Shabbat. I'm there to support them and help them, but it's theirs. And I think that that's one of the gifts that we give our youth as a religion. How many 13-year-olds get to run anything?
Sure. Oh yeah, no, that
right?
sounds cool.
And be in charge, and and tell people, please rise, please sit down, please turn to page 73. It may not sound like much, but when you're 13, that's pretty awesome.
How many people go into rabbinical service? I mean, you figure if a large number are getting bar or bat mitzvah, how many stay with that
and become rabbis? A small number, small percentage. My rabbinical school is actually right now one of the bigger ones, and and even there, you've got a number that come in, and not everybody who enters finishes. Which I did the first time, right? I entered, and thanks to the change in my family economy and dynamics, life happens.
Yeah.
And that happens along the line. The URJ has HUCJIR, a seminary, and that seminary's in New York, Cincinnati, LA, and in Jerusalem. They've got campuses, and then there's AJR, and there's RRC, the Reconstructionist, and then there's a whole bunch of different seminaries.
It would be
Boston.
cool. It's going to the seminary in Jerusalem.
Well, most students are required to spend 1 year.
Oh,
at least 1 year.
Awesome. Yeah.
Because how can you tell somebody anything about what you might, right? Even a year is hard to really get much, but you get a different idea of what Israel's about. And, the Jews have an interesting relationship with Israel. We're not Israelis. Israel's its own country. I'm an American. It's the American military I served in. I didn't mention that part in my life stuff, history.
Yeah,
but, there's
another chapter
another
there.
little segment there. We have a love for Israel, and that's really the best way to describe it. There's a tie, there's a love, but it is not and should not be blind. And the danger is if you don't go and spend some time there, then it's this little ideal concept in your mind, and you've got perhaps rose-colored glasses on. But Israel's a country. It's got crime, it's got prostitutes, it's got all the same stuff. They've got bank robbers just like we do.
But the history there is just.
But there's tons of history. Yeah.
Yeah.
As somebody once put it, you can walk where somebody's donkey once walked.
Yeah.
But it does. It changes things. You sit there and you read descriptions in scriptures, and you've seen it, right? Or you've gone to the archaeological dig in Jericho. You've gone up in Masada. You've gone into the temple area. The wall is the courtyard wall. It's not really the temple wall. And, so you've walked and looked at these things. And it changes. It changes how you feel about things. But everything in your life changes. And the more experience you have on just about anything, the better you're going to be at whatever you're doing. And so, RRC requires a year in Israel. URJ requires a year in Israel. Pretty sure the conservative do as well. And of course, there are many seminaries in Israel. More for the Orthodox, but yeah.
What is the percentage of Orthodox now?
In the U.S., it's about 10 to 12%. It's not very large. The largest denomination of Jews in America is Reform. About 40 to 50% of American Jews are Reform.
Now, what about Europe?
Europe, it's, I don't know the exact percentages, but it's more either progressive or Orthodox. It's not, it doesn't have as many variations as we have in America. But that's true of a lot of things. We have more Christianities in America than the rest of the world has. We have more everythings, it seems. And I think part of that's the melting pot demographic mosaic of America. Everybody gets exposed to something, and when I teach the Religion in America course, one of the things that I always say to my students in that class, and I say it in the other classes as well, is that every religion that comes to America changes America, and America changes that religion.
Ooh.
It goes both ways. And, anybody who thinks that religion stays stagnant is not paying attention. Even the Orthodox change, they just change more slowly. But they change too. Orthodoxy is different than it was when I was little. My father came out of an Orthodox family, and I see the differences both in his family, my family, and in Orthodoxy in general. Lots of changes. They're just slower because the world changes. Technology changes, relationships change, communication changes, cell phones. You want to talk about something that's changed the world?
Oh, yeah.
Right? The availability of information.
Sure.
Right? Look at here. There's a little news flash on my phone. I show a clip out of Star Trek, The Next Generation, to my students. And in it, I have to tell them, you see people using what appears to be cell phones. These didn't exist yet.
Yes.
You can probably thank Gene Roddenberry for moving it along. He certainly is responsible for the diagnostic beds in the hospital, right? Because everybody looked at what Bones had. He had, right, the vitals were behind
Sure.
each patient, and doctors went, that would be really handy. And then technology followed. So, we get our ideas from all over. And the world is different. We do not live in our grandparents' world. And it's rough on them if they're still running around and they haven't kept up with it.
Well, whoever thought you could carry your Torah in your hand?
Yeah, not only that, not only can I carry the Torah in my hand, but I've got a prayer book that knows where I am and what the appropriate prayer is for right now. So when I fire up that app, it actually comes up, like right now it would come to the afternoon prayer.
Wow.
Because it says, this is the time for the afternoon prayer in Port St. Lucie, Florida. It knows when sunset is. It knows all those things. Never had that before. Yeah.
You talk about technology.
Yeah. Well, and it was sobering to me. I was at a rabbi's conference, and I was debating, what my relationship was going to be with technology. And I happened to glance as I'm sitting there with my little prayer book, and I happened to look around, and I'd say 2/3 of my colleagues are on their phone using the prayer book on their phone or on a tablet.
I love it.
And I'm like, okay, that's the answer. And that's actually when I downloaded the app. Right then and there, I sat there and said, I'm going to learn how to do this. And I started getting apps on my phone. Yeah. So, of all crazy things, it was praying at a rabbi's conference on a weekday.
Go figure.
Yep. So those are some of the things. So the world continues to change. This has been Rabbi Shafir Lobb, and this has been Ask a Rabbi. Thank you.
Where are you located?
Our congregation is located on 540 Northwest University Boulevard, Suite 102 in Port St. Lucie, right across from Met Stadium. Please join us there. Thank you.
You have a good week.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye. And thanks for joining me on streaming.
You've been listening to Ask a Rabbi right here on WPSL, Port St. Lucie, WPSL Worldwide, webcaster to the world on Alexa and Google Home.